Welcome to Eddie's Studio 30 Live. I'm John Dioso, the editor of Eddie's Studio 30. Today we're going to discuss how Shutterstock is leading the movement for more inclusive content. Shutterstock is one of the world's leading global platforms for content and applications, and media companies, agencies, and brands who use their content often literally control the images that define how mainstream culture views the world. And Shutterstock recently released the latest edition of its annual report on diversity as part of its vision to ensure that all creative content represents the diverse global community and to highlight the importance of more diversity, equity, and inclusion behind the lens and in all corners of the workplace, including the executive suite. Joining me today to discuss why now is the time for action that affects real change and what that means for the industry at large is Meeckel Beecher, Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Shutterstock. Welcome, Meeckel. Oh, there you go. You sounded like a robot there for a second, but that's okay.
Are you hearing me now? Technical difficulties, right? Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great having you. And welcome everybody out there for joining us. Please drop us a note and tell us where you are in the world so we can give you a shout out later. All right, so Meeckel, before we get into Shutterstock's diversity report, tell us a little bit about you, about your career. What led you to Shutterstock and what are your goals and responsibilities there?
Sure. So, my background is actually in media and communication. I was trained in broadcast journalism, and I am a product of the 2008 recession. After I graduated from college, I was thinking through what do I need to do and what are some of the opportunities there. And somehow I landed at working with the National Museum of Jamaica as a communication and education officer. And I share that because it was a great experience in terms of my approach to equity and inclusion because working for a museum, you start to think about things like equity and whose stories are told and why, and who gets memorialized and why. And so I spent a long time at that museum thinking about things like that. But also, one of the main things I was tasked with was to ensure that the museum itself and our collection overall was accessible to the general public. If you think about the social context of Jamaica, which is where the museum was, which is where I spent a large part of my life, we were situated in a community where a lot of the people were not able to actually access the building itself, and that was for a number of reasons. One of them including financial access, and two, that they just didn't see themselves in the museum. And so part of what we did was to ensure that how do we change that narrative and how do we get these people inside the museum to be able to see themselves? And that's also involved telling their stories, right? And so since then, I've been thinking about my career as at the intersection of equity, media, and just general purpose, and working with companies just to lead and to figure out what their purpose is in society and the impact that they can make. And so over the last couple of years, I went from supporting DEI and social impact as their comms person to moving into the space of providing the programmatic piece, so developing the programs that exist within the companies to help to move the needle on social impact, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I've been doing that for the last couple of years. At Shutterstock, I mean, the transition to Shutterstock was interesting because it kind of brought me back to my roots in terms of media production and all of that, and just the general interest that I had in that as a young person, which is how I got involved in the field in the first place. But it also provided this new opportunity for me to help to shape the direction where the company is going in for DEI. And I think of my role at Shutterstock as or my team's role at Shutterstock as this center of excellence, where we work with different business partners to help them to think about DEI as not just a check the box, but something that's integrated into how it is that they approach their work. And my hope is that if I were to disappear from Shutterstock one day, that the philosophy that we have as a company and how people are approaching their work would be so embedded, with DEI being one of the criteria that we think about all the time when we're making decisions overall. And so that's what I hope to achieve there. That's my ultimate goal. We started to do that along 3 lines, which we'll get into later on. But the idea there is that everyone has a responsibility, as far as I'm concerned, for DEI, and how that is manifested depends on the information and the tools that they have and how it is that they will end up doing their jobs overall.
Right, that's great. So yeah, let's get into the report a little bit. So what is the scope of Shutterstock's annual report and what are its primary goals?
So the report we've been doing for a while now, as you said, it is an annual report. And so the scope of it is that we surveyed 2,700 marketers across 9 countries to kind of get an understanding of how these marketers are thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in their content, and how are their attitudes towards it, how are they actually using it. And the things that we focused on were there are 5 areas. It was sexuality, it's disability, it's age, there's race and ethnicity, and um, there's another area that I'm blanking on now. But essentially, we went over these areas to see how are the marketers approaching these areas in their content. And we thought this was important for us to think through because as we support brands in this transition, what are some of the things that we need to be doing as a company? How it is that we currently are situated that could help them themselves? We see it as a way to meet the moment, to figure out we have a large collection and can help them to do this. But what are some of the other opportunities that are coming up that we haven't been thinking about that we can actually help them to be able to tell more inclusive stories? And that is really critical as we more people are demanding this. More of our We saw what happened last year in terms of the Black Black Lives Matter movement and the Stop Asian Hate movement, and overall, we're seeing more people thinking about DEI. And so we thought this is an opportunity to think to get more of that information to help us prepare and to also support the marketers and the brands that we work with and to help them to achieve their purpose.
Great. And let's bring up the report. And you can, is this available to the public now? People can go to the website and download this?
Absolutely. So the report is publicly available on Shutterstock.com, so people are able to just go to the site and download it.
Great. And as you said, you surveyed over 2,700 partners in countries all around the world. And you brought up before the social justice movement. So in the wake of Black Lives Matter and Stop Asian Hate and other social justice movements, and it's such a wide-ranging report. What has changed? I mean, we had such a momentous year last year with all these movements happening also in the wake of the pandemic, which just exacerbated a lot of those issues even more in our society. How did that affect your partners, and how did that affect the report? So what is the difference? I suspect it's a much different, there was much more deeper maybe response or analysis that went into this report than maybe previous ones.
Yeah, I think that's a critical piece, John, where we saw that last year, as you said, was a year that's unlike any other in terms of the movements, the social justice movements, as well as the COVID restrictions that were placed on people. I feel when I think about DEI over the last couple of years, a lot of times it felt as if companies were like, okay, this is important, but I don't know if we have the resources to do it now. What I felt happened in 2020 was that it fell more on companies' radars and that you saw that more people were taking actions. I mean, if you think about the number of like declarations that were made by companies about things that they're going to do and some of them are doing now, it was almost as if like DEI as a concept, as a function, got a huge catapult overall that we've never seen before. And I think that's a good thing. And so when it comes to the actual report, we are also seeing something similar to that kind of reaction among our marketers. I believe like 2/3 of the marketers thought that the Black Lives Matter movement and the Stop Asian Hate movement impacted how the decisions that they made around content. This year, we saw that half of the marketers globally actually thought that representing people, racial and ethnic diversity are really critical for them to be incorporated in their marketing approaches. In terms of changes that we saw from the 2019 report to the 2020 report, one of the big things that I really welcome was that there was actually more marketers thinking about including transgender and gender non-binary people in their marketing campaign. And this is really huge. Like in 2019, it's a slight increase because in 2019 it was 12%. In 2020, it was 16%. But to me, it's headed in the right direction, right? Because we need to be able to show the world as it exists right now. And the world as it exists right now exists of multiple people with different identities and feelings and so on. And so the best way to represent the world is in that way. Another interesting statistic that we saw is that, in fact, more marketers are thinking that it's important to represent the world accurately. And accurately to me means that you represent the world as it is. And from 2019 it was 34%, and in 2020 it was 39%. And so, like the representation of transgender models and non-binary models in campaigns, we're seeing that more people are thinking about the importance of actually representing the world. And to me, that's the direction that we need to continue moving in.
Great. And, I want to get a little even more deeper into the report, how it's affecting both what Shutterstock, how Shutterstock works, who they partner with, or how their partners are working, and how it may be affecting Shutterstock itself. And also, I want to get even more deeper into the global implications of this. But before we do that, I just want to, if you're just joining us, this is Ad Age Studio 30 Live. I'm John Dioso, the editor of Studio 30, and I'm with Meeckel Beecher, who's the global head of diversity, equity, inclusion at Shutterstock. And he's here to tell us how the global company is leading the movement for more inclusive content. But before we get back to the conversation, I just want to say hi to some people who've been joining us. So this is where I get to play radio DJ. Sheila, shout out to Sheila, Quincy, Cameron, Debbie, Sherry, and Polly. I'm sure you're joining us from all points of the world, given the conversation that we're having today. Thank you all for joining us. So let's get back to the questions there, Meeckel. So how did the DE&I initiatives at Shutterstock tie in with the content that you produce and the partners that you work with? And you started talking a little bit before about there being 3 parts. I'd love you to kind of just explain that a little deeper.
Sure. So I joined Shutterstock about 6 months ago with the effort of thinking about, as I said, how do we approach DEI, right? And one of the things that is really critical for Shutterstock to really be thinking about this, because we are a global company, both in terms of what our internal teams look like, as well as what the audience that we serve globally. And so we genuinely believe that diversity is a strength of ours, and that's what breeds innovation. It helps us to meet the needs of people globally that we serve and all of that, right? And so since I've been in, what we've done is to think about DEI holistically. And that means thinking about DEI from 3 pillars that you mentioned. And the first pillar is inclusive culture. And to me, what that means is establishing an environment where all employees, regardless of their background, regardless of their lived experiences, are able to come to Shutterstock and do well, because they don't have to be thinking about the impact that their background or their experiences will have on the company itself. You hear people in DEI probably say all the time that it's about being their authentic self. And whatever that authentic self is going to be individual. And so what we want to do is to create the space for people to be able to do that and focus on the things that are important, right? And focus on the things that will help to make them feel more fulfilled overall. And so part of that is us as a company looking at what our current environment looks like, what our policies are like, and all of that. And we're dedicated to doing that type of work, right? To ensure and creating spaces where employees can actually give us the feedback that's necessary for us to evolve over time. The second pillar is recruitment and retention. And that focuses on ensuring that we as a company are bringing in the diversity among our teams. And like a lot of companies in tech, there is work to be done. And so we've started working on that already since I've joined. And how I usually approach the recruitment and retention piece is that it's a network problem. And by that, I mean that there isn't a shortage of talent in my perspective. It's the networks that aren't connected. So it's a Shutterstock network that's not connecting with the network of other talent that is historically underrepresented or in our system, right? And so how do you do that, and how do you fix that? To me, is like cracking the network code. And so what we've been doing so far is working with an organization called Black Professionals in Tech that will help our leaders connect more to Black talent, right? We also started working with Women Who Code to get our jobs out there, to get more people, more women to be excited about the possibility of working at Shutterstock. We are working on some pretty exciting thing, and I think everyone wants to be a part of something that's exciting and interesting. And so for us, what we need to do is to break that network gap and just to get people in, and also to keep them. And you keep them by providing the space that's attached to the inclusive culture bit, where people are actually able to see themselves growing in the organization and being able to know that regardless of their lived experiences, that would not be held against them. And so that's the second pillar that we're focusing on. The third pillar is business and community. And the focus there is about our product itself and the impact that we have on our community, right? We're thinking through what are the ways that we can ensure that we have accurate representation in our content, and that what we have there isn't offensive. Like, we recently launched a DEI policy that basically provides education and guidance around the content in our network to our contributors. And the idea there is that we're trying to educate our contributors to help them to, when they're using keywords to establish metadata in our collection, what the words that they use matter, right? And so we're saying there are some words that are just not acceptable on our platform overall, and we'll help you through that process in order to understand how and what is actually acceptable, because it's about displaying people with humanity. And so we want to avoid people describing people in ways that just does not honor their identity overall. Another way that we're thinking about DEI is growing our contributor network. One of the interesting thing about Shutterstock, and a good thing about Shutterstock, is how global we are, right? And so we have a network of global representation where the content can be more authentic that way. And so, but we do need to grow the network. We do need to get more people that probably were excluded before. And how we're doing that, for example, is that we launched last year something called the Create Fund. And the idea behind that is, usually historically excluded people do not have the same kind of support that's necessary to enter into a system. And so to help people enter into the system, what you do is that you provide the mentorship that's necessary. You provide sometimes grants that's necessary. And so the Create Fund, what it does is provide the grants, one aspect of it, to artists. It's called an artist investment program, right? And so we provide grants, we provide mentorship, we provide additional support that these artists will actually need in order to grow and to enter into our ecosystem. Over the last month or so, we've been partnering with organizations like Black Women Photographers and Diversify Photo and Howard University as well, just to hold a webinar series that focuses on getting the information out more about what this is and how people can get in. Then the second aspect of it is, how do we raise the conversation and the visibility around topics that are important for inclusion? And we're doing that through a grant contest piece of the Create Fund. The most recent one being focused on LGBTQ inclusion, and the idea that the LGBTQ reality goes beyond the rainbow. And so the representation of that needs to go beyond the rainbow. Like, LGBTQ people have families and friends and so on. And so a part of our job is to be able to do that. And so we're approaching DEI holistically from those three pillars of inclusive culture, recruitment and retention, business community, with the idea that everything connects. And for us to have a true voice in our industry around this topic, we need to be doing it that way.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. There's a lot to unpack there in those three pillars, and I feel like, is it as massive an undertaking as it sounds like?
It is massive, and that's the thing about my role itself, is that I don't really own any of these areas, and so it's going to be reliant on me working with the partners. And the good thing is that I even before I joined, I saw that there were pockets of this work actually happening in different areas. So I'm thinking about myself again as a connector of these ideas to ensure that there's consistency across the organization, because I think that's the way that our impact is going to be greater, only if we're able to connect our ideas and truly come out as a Shutterstock perspective, as opposed to one aspect of our business.
And I'm glad that you brought yourself up there, and and how you see your role as connecting the various stakeholders at Shutterstock to accomplish all these goals. And I'm especially thankful that you kind of gave your story at the beginning, because I can't help but see how your own personal journey that led you to Shutterstock in this particular role is being reflected in all these activations that you're working on. It really does seem to, thinking a little bit outside the box to kind of come up with ideas to, okay, well, what are we missing? How are we accomplish these things?
It's a journey, John, that I think you have to be committed to the long haul of it. It's not going to happen overnight. But what I think is required is action and accountability, right? So it's not just about statements, it's not just about conversations. It's saying, what do we need to get to? And how do we get there? If we fall short of that, what were the issues? And how do we fix those? I think that's how you run businesses generally. And so I don't think there should be any exception to doing DEI work that way.
Good, and again, there's so much more, really interesting insights from this report. And one of the things that I want to get into before we run out of time is kind of diving even deeper into the global aspect of it. You know, we in our industry, especially in this country, are so focused, laser focused, maybe too hyper focused on what's going on just within our own borders. But as a global company, you know, what are the global implications that you saw from the social justice movement and DE&I initiatives that you saw from the report, in the report?
Totally. So the good thing is that when it comes to DEI, globally, we're seeing that people are thinking that it's important and it is something that needs to be focused on. But like in Asian countries, like South Korea, for example, we're seeing that there's a lot of conservatism that still exists, and so that's preventing the work from being done. But interestingly, though, even in South Korea itself, I think about 84% of the marketers that we surveyed there thought that DEI was important. So that to me is acknowledgement that yes, it is important. And then 82% said that there's a lot of work to be done. So they know that there's a shortcoming there. And to me, that gives me hope that something more would be done, even regardless of the conservatism in which they exist, right? But
Mm-hmm.
in Australia, for example, we saw that 76% of the marketers were impacted by the Stop Asian Hate and the Black Lives Matter movement. And because in the decisions that they made around colorism. So it's a bit different. So when they're choosing models, colorism came into the situation. And because of those movements, those impacted them, right? But we also saw that there were issues in outside of the US in terms of, I believe it was 44% of marketers who said that it was hard to source diverse content, which I think is where Shutterstock can come in terms of what we offer, right? You know, as I mentioned earlier, we are global. We have about 1.9 million contributors globally. And so that allows us to be able to create content from a local perspective that showcases the lived experience of people. And like, for example, we were able to work in Turkey with Amazon to create a full campaign that use local content and local content creators, and so a local cast, right? And so that is the power, I think, of our ecosystem itself. And there is more work for us to do. And the Create Fund that I spoke about, as well as other things that we're thinking about, is going to help us to do that work and to get more content to our clients that are local and representative and inclusive.
You know, one of the surprising things that I saw in looking at the report, and I think a little bit just scrolled by before, was Brazil. You know, just thinking about, you know, I actually went to Brazil when I was a child and haven't been there in years, but just following what's been going on there in the news, you know, knowing what their political situation is like, I was a little surprised to see that, well, maybe the creative community is not quite, maybe completely opposite to what might be going on
Yeah.
in the political community there. But the question that I wanted to ask is, it comes down to the cultural impact of this, which is, you just mentioned South Korea, a little bit more conservative, maybe in the way they approach LGBTQ issues. You know, Brazil or any other place where you're talking about, there must be some, I mean, it's almost like, as in your role in Shutterstock being a global company, you have to almost be a diplomat in some sense and kind of be able to kind of negotiate with various stakeholders all around the world with different cultural sensibilities. It's almost like you're a mini United Nations. So how do you navigate that?
Right. I think what is going to happen is that the cultural advances that are happening in our society are going to have to dictate how um, countries respond. And I think what we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement and the Stop Asian Hate movement is that it's forcing people to go in the direction that is, as some people would say, the right side of history, right? And so that's going to evolve there. And our position is that we're going to represent the content needs of what it is that our brands are asking for and what we think is representative of the world.
That's great. So we just have like about a minute left. In the time that we have left, what would be your key takeaways? So after you've just been at Shutterstock for a short time, and you just released this report. What would be the key lessons that you would want our audience to take away from today?
Yeah, I mean, if we're speaking specifically of the report and that is geared towards marketers, I think just approaching their marketing from, I really like three pillars apparently, but three perspectives. Ensure that your team is diverse itself, because that's how you avoid some of these issues and that's how you represent the world itself. The second, you incorporate DEI into your strategy overall, to be able to know that it's a point of measurement going forward in your strategy. And the third is just to build in accountability. A lot of things with DEI is that there are going to be people in power that need to be held accountable, right? And those people need to create environments where other people can hold them accountable. And I think that those three things are going to be critical, not just for marketing, but overall as we approach DEI, to ensure that it's embedded and it's something that we're thinking about and it's no longer a check the box or a thing to the side.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. But thank you so much for those words of wisdom, Meeckel Beecher, the Shutterstock's Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And most of all, thank you, everybody, for joining us for Ad Age Studio 30 Live. I'm John Dioso. Bye.